The wind was sharp that morning in Miami, stirring the palms along the shoreline, as if nature itself knew something was about to change. The sky was the color of polished steel, bright and clear, with thin white clouds scattered across it like streaks of smoke. Robert Miller stood on the balcony of his oceanfront penthouse, sipping black coffee from a porcelain cup that had cost more than most people's weekly salary. He wasn't thinking about the view, though. His mind was on the meeting ahead, the numbers, and the quiet unease that had been growing in his chest for months. He was 42, and already a name that commanded boardrooms and headlines. Miller Technologies had risen from a garage project into one of the country's leading AI development firms, producing everything from financial automation to advanced robotics. Investors adored him. Journalists called him the man who predicted the future. But success had a strange weight, and lately it pressed on him harder each day. Behind the glass doors of the penthouse, his wife, Amanda, moved silently through the living room, her phone glued to her ear. Her voice was low, careful, a tone she used when she didn't want him to listen. He had stopped trying to ask months ago. Once they had been close, partners not only in marriage, but in ambition. She had been by his side when he took his first loan, had celebrated the first big contract with champagne in plastic cups. But now her smiles had turned rehearsed, her affection hollow. They slept in the same house, but lived in different worlds. "Your flight's in 2 hours," she said, without looking at him when she finally hung up. Her voice was flat, polite, like a secretary's. "I know," he replied, setting the empty cup on the table. "I'll be back in 2 days. Tell the kids I'll call them tonight." She nodded, still not meeting his eyes. Her hair fell perfectly against her cheek, golden and precise, as if she had been sculpted rather than born. He wanted to say something real, but nothing came. Instead, he picked up his suitcase and walked to the door. "Robert," she called after him. He turned, expecting a goodbye kiss, or at least a word of care. But she only said, "Good luck with the deal." Luck. The word tasted wrong. He nodded once and left. At the private airfield, the sun had fully risen, gleaming off the sleek silver body of the company jet. His pilot, an older man named Harris, greeted him with a nod. The flight was supposed to be short, Miami to a small island near the Bahamas, where he was scheduled to meet investors for a new offshore data hub. The project would triple his company's market value if it worked. But as Robert climbed the narrow steps into the jet, a flicker of doubt touched his mind. The weather forecast had been clear yesterday, but the horizon looked oddly dark. He brushed the thought aside and settled into the leather seat. As the engines hummed to life, he felt the faint vibration through the soles of his shoes. The jet rose smoothly into the sky, cutting through clouds like a knife through silk. For a while, everything was calm. He opened his laptop, reviewed the latest proposal, and let himself sink into work. 2 hours into the flight, the world began to tremble. It started as a soft rattle, like turbulence. Then the plane lurched violently, sending his coffee across the cabin floor. Harris's voice came over the intercom, calm but tight. "Sir, we've got a weather front moving in fast. Unexpected storm cell. Fasten your seatbelt." Robert buckled in, heart pounding. The jet shook again, harder this time. He could see flashes of lightning beyond the window, bright against the darkening sky. Clouds thickened like bruises. Rain hammered the fuselage. The plane dipped suddenly, and his stomach dropped as gravity twisted around him. "Harris!" he shouted. "What's happening?" "Engines are struggling static interference." The rest was lost to static. The cabin lights flickered. Another blast of thunder rolled through the sky, so loud it felt like the heavens had split. The aircraft jolted sideways, alarms blaring, red lights strobing across the cockpit door. Robert's seatbelt bit into his chest. He tried to grab the armrest, but the world was spinning now, the horizon flipping, the clouds rushing up, the roar of wind filling every corner of his mind. Then came the sound he would remember for the rest of his life, the scream of tearing metal. Everything went black. When he woke, the world was silent except for the distant crash of waves. His body ached, his mouth dry as sand. He was lying on his side, half buried in warm grit, and above him the sun blazed down, blinding. For a moment he thought he was dreaming, but then he saw the wreckage, shards of metal scattered along the beach, a twisted fragment of wing jutting out of the surf like a dying bird. He pushed himself up, gasping. His left arm was scraped raw, blood crusting along his skin. The air smelled of salt, smoke, and something metallic. Pieces of luggage floated in the shallows. The cockpit was gone. Harris was gone. The radio, the emergency beacon. Nothing. "Hello," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Is anyone there?" The sea answered with its endless rhythm. He stumbled along the sand, searching the shoreline for any sign of life. There were no footprints but his own. Palm trees lined the edge of the island, their leaves whispering softly in the wind. Beyond them stretched dense green jungle, thick and unwelcoming. Hours passed. He found part of a crate washed ashore, food wrappers, a flare gun with no flares, a half-empty bottle of water. He drank greedily, ignoring the sting of salt on his lips. The sun scorched his neck, the sweat drying into salt. As night fell, the temperature dropped, and he realized just how alone he was. He built a crude shelter out of debris, stacking pieces of fuselage and palm branches. It wasn't much, but it kept the wind off. When he finally lay down, every sound in the dark made him flinch, the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, the soft hiss of the tide creeping up the sand. He closed his eyes and tried to remember Amanda's face, the last thing she had said to him. "Good luck with the deal." He laughed bitterly in the dark. Luck. That was all he had left now. The next morning, he began to explore. The island wasn't large, maybe 2 miles across, surrounded by jagged rocks and coral that made swimming impossible. There were coconut trees, small crabs scuttling along the beach, and a few seabirds circling above. He found a freshwater stream trickling from the rocks inland, and that discovery gave him the first spark of hope he'd felt since waking up. He drank until his stomach ached. Days blended together after that. He learned to climb for coconuts, to crack them open with rocks, to fish with sharpened sticks. His hands blistered and bled, but he survived. Each morning he scanned the horizon, searching for a ship, a plane, any sign of rescue. Each evening he watched the sun sink into the ocean, wondering if Amanda and the kids thought of him. On the 7th day, he built a signal fire from driftwood and dry leaves, arranging it on the highest point of the island. He kept it ready to light, hoping someone would see. But the days stretched into weeks, and no one came. At night, when the stars spread across the sky like shards of glass, he lay awake, thinking about everything he had left behind. The company, the deals, the sterile meetings where money seemed more real than people. He thought about how far he'd come from the man who once wanted to change the world, and how little that meant now, on an island that didn't care about power or wealth. 2 weeks passed. His beard grew thick, his clothes torn, his skin burned by the sun. But he kept moving, kept surviving. Because somewhere inside him was a small, stubborn fire that refused to die. And yet, even as he fought to live, a shadow of doubt had begun to form. A quiet voice whispering that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't an accident at all. He didn't know it yet, but that thought would be the beginning of everything that followed. Because far away, in Miami, Amanda Miller was standing in his office, smiling for the cameras, saying all the right words about her late husband, while her eyes flicked toward the company's board members, with something cold and triumphant hiding just beneath the grief. Robert Miller, somewhere across the endless blue, was still alive. But the world had already buried him. The nights had grown longer, or maybe Robert had simply forgotten how to measure time without a clock. The stars were his only markers now, cold and infinite, scattered like frost across the black velvet of the sky. When he first crashed on the island, he had counted each sunrise as if it were a promise, a step closer to being found. But now, after days that had blurred into weeks, he no longer knew what day it was. His beard was coarse and ragged, his hands calloused and covered in small cuts. He was still alive, but survival had stripped him of the man he used to be. Each morning began the same way. The sound of the tide pulling at the sand, the cries of the gulls overhead, and the steady ache in his muscles as he pulled himself out of the shelter. He had built the structure better now, a proper roof of palm fronds woven together and tied with strips of fabric torn from the plane seats. It wasn't much, but it had survived the wind and rain. The shelter stood just beyond the high tide line, protected by a large driftwood log that served as both a wall and a bench. His first task every morning was water. The small stream he'd found inland still flowed steadily, and he had learned to collect it using half coconut shells. The taste was fresh, clean, and it had become his most precious resource. The hunger, however, was constant and cruel. There were days when he caught nothing, when the traps he'd set for crabs came up empty, and the ocean mocked him with the flash of silver scales just beyond reach. He'd lost weight quickly. His clothes hung loose on him, and his ribs showed through his tanned skin like shadows beneath parchment. But over time, his instincts sharpened. He had learned to read the tides, to recognize when the fish would move close to the rocks. He built a spear from a broken piece of fuselage and a sharpened metal rod. It took patience and pain. The first time he tried to stab a fish, he slipped on the wet stone and sliced open his leg. The salt water burned like fire, and the wound took days to scab over. But when he finally caught his first fish, a small parrotfish glinting blue and green, he laughed out loud, a sound raw and wild, echoing across the empty beach. That night, as he roasted it over a small fire, the smell of charred salt and smoke filled the air. He ate slowly, savoring every bite as though it were a feast. He had figured out the fire after nearly a week of failure. Matches and lighters had been useless, soaked by the sea. The secret came from desperation, a broken magnifying lens from his watch, the sun, and a handful of dry palm fibers. When the first thin line of smoke curled upward, he had felt something close to divine. Now, the fire was his companion. It kept the night at bay and the insects away, and its flickering light reminded him that he was still human. But the island was not merciful. Some nights brought storms that turned the sky into a screaming wall of water and wind. His shelter would shake, the rain hammering the roof like stones, and he would huddle inside, clutching his makeshift spear, praying the wind wouldn't tear everything away. During one of those nights, lightning struck a palm not far from his camp. The sound was deafening, a violent crack that seemed to split the world in two. When morning came, the beach was littered with debris, the sand scoured by wind and waves. He rebuilt what he could, silent and methodical, as if repair were a form of prayer. Days passed like this, the same rhythm of hunger, work, exhaustion. But something in him had changed. The man who had once built an empire from numbers and negotiations had vanished. What remained was simpler, rawer. He no longer thought of money, or meetings, or even comfort. He thought only of the next hour, the next wave, the next meal. Sometimes he talked to himself, small mutterings, half sentences to break the silence. Other times, he would talk to the ocean, demanding it to give him back his life. One afternoon, while exploring deeper inland, he stumbled across the wreckage of the plane's tail section, half buried in vines. His heart stopped. He approached slowly, his hands trembling as he pulled away the leaves and sand. Inside were the remains of the emergency kit, a flare gun, soaked beyond use, a first aid box with only a few bandages left, and a waterproof bag containing a satellite phone. Hope exploded in his chest. He wiped the mud from the phone, pressed the power button, and waited. Nothing. He tried again, harder. Still nothing. The battery was dead. He laughed, not out of amusement but despair. A deep, ragged sound that broke into a sob halfway through. He carried the phone back to his camp anyway. Each night he would check it again, though he knew it was useless. It became a symbol, not of rescue, but of faith. The days stretched into what must have been a month. His hair grew longer, his skin tougher, and his mind quieter. He had stopped thinking about the world beyond the island, or at least he tried to. But memories came unbidden. Amanda's face, framed by soft light in their kitchen, her laugh, or the memory of it, before it turned into something sharp and cold. The children, Lillian and Thomas, their voices echoing through the hallways of the house. He wondered what they had been told. Were they crying for him? Or had Amanda already started the process of moving on? He imagined her sitting at his desk, the company's logo shining on the wall behind her, the board members offering condolences with one hand while drafting new deals with the other. It was during one of these long, feverish nights that the first suspicion took shape. He had been staring at the dead satellite phone when a single memory flickered through his mind. Amanda's conversation that morning before he left, her tone, the way she had avoided his eyes. It was small, almost meaningless, but something about it had felt rehearsed. Then he remembered the insurance policy, a new one they had signed only a month before his flight, one that transferred his shares to her in the event of his death. The coincidence scraped at him like sand against glass. At first he dismissed it. Accidents happened. Planes went down. But as the thought settled, it refused to leave. He replayed every detail of that last morning. Her smile, too brief, her final words. Good luck with the deal. There had been no warmth in them, no trace of fear or worry, only distance. He told himself he was imagining it, that isolation was twisting his mind. But deep down, a seed of doubt had been planted. Another week passed, and his body began to betray him. The constant exposure had worn him down. His lips cracked from the sun, his feet bled from walking on coral. One day, while trying to catch a fish in the shallows, he slipped and drove the point of his spear through his palm. The pain was white-hot, searing. He tore a strip from his shirt and wrapped it tightly, trembling as blood soaked through. That night, fever came. The world spun around him, and shadows moved along the walls of his shelter, whispering things he didn't want to hear. When the fever broke, he found himself lying outside under the morning sun, his clothes damp with sweat. He had crawled out of the shelter sometime during the night, delirious. He stared up at the blue sky and felt a strange calm wash over him. Maybe this was it, he thought. Maybe this was how it ended, not with a scream, but with a whisper. He closed his eyes and waited for death, but death didn't come. Instead, as the day faded into dusk, he saw something move far out on the horizon. At first, he thought it was another hallucination, a trick of the light. But then he saw it again, a dark shape against the glow of the setting sun, moving slowly across the water. His heart jolted. A ship! He stumbled to his feet, nearly falling as dizziness hit him. His legs were weak, his head pounding, but adrenaline pushed him forward. He tore through the sand, shouting, waving his arms. His voice was hoarse, barely audible over the wind. The ship didn't turn. He grabbed the flare gun from the wreckage, the one he'd written off weeks ago, and loaded it with the single remaining cartridge he'd dried by the fire. Hands shaking, he aimed it at the sky and pulled the trigger. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the flare erupted, a brilliant red streak cutting through the dusk. It arched high, hung for a breathless second, and then burst into light. He screamed until his throat tore. "Here! I'm here!" But the ship kept moving, steady, indifferent, vanishing into the distance. When the flare died, he fell to his knees. The light had burned out, and with it, the last of his strength. He sank into the wet sand, the ocean lapping at his hands. His voice broke into a sound that wasn't quite laughter or sobbing, something between them. That night, he didn't light a fire. He sat in the darkness, listening to the whisper of the waves. The despair was a living thing, wrapping around him like fog. He thought about Amanda again, about her voice, her eyes, and the possibility, no, the certainty, that this was not fate. Someone had wanted him gone. And as the first light of dawn touched the edge of the sea, Robert Miller made himself a promise. If he ever got off this island, if he ever set foot on American soil again, he would find out who had put him here. The sun rose higher, golden and cruel. He stood on the beach, weary but alive, staring at the endless horizon. Somewhere beyond that vast expanse of water lay the truth, and he would find it, even if it killed him. When the night fell again, it brought no comfort. The stars, once symbols of guidance, had become cold eyes staring down at Robert, as if they too were judging him for his naive faith in the world he'd built. 2 months had passed since the crash, though time had lost its shape here. It existed only through repetition, the endless rhythm of the tide, the rising and falling of the sun, the unbroken silence that filled the space between his heartbeat and the waves. His body had adapted to the island's cruelty. He was leaner now, every muscle carved by hunger and necessity. His skin, burned first by the sun and then hardened by wind and salt, had taken on the coarse look of survival. But the transformation that mattered most was inside. The fear that had once controlled him had become something sharper: suspicion, purpose, and the growing need to understand why he was still alive when everything else had been destroyed. He spent his mornings repairing what storms had taken, his afternoons scavenging for food, and his nights thinking about the past. He could remember every word Amanda had said to him on the morning of his flight, every flicker of expression on her face. He had replayed it so many times that the memory had begun to distort, reshaping itself under the weight of his doubt. Each time, her tone seemed colder, her gaze more distant, her parting words, "Good luck with the deal," more like a farewell than encouragement. He had been a fool, he thought bitterly. A man too blinded by his own empire to see the cracks forming beneath his feet. Amanda had stood beside him through the rise of Miller Technologies, smiling for photographs, her hand resting lightly on his arm as the cameras flashed. She had known how to charm investors, how to host dinners that sealed multi-million-dollar contracts, how to look like the perfect partner in a life built on ambition. And yet, for all her poise, there had been something lurking behind her eyes. Calculation, or maybe resentment. He remembered her standing on their balcony, looking out at the city lights, saying once, "It's never enough for you, is it, Robert? You don't even know when to stop." At the time, he had brushed it off as frustration, the kind that came from long hours and too many business trips. But now, sitting on the sand, with nothing but the wind for company, those words returned like poison. He had thought the crash was an accident, an act of God or fate. But fate, he realized, rarely arranges storms so conveniently. And it wasn't just Amanda who had reasons to want him gone. The company had been worth billions, and its future had always been a subject of silent war among the board. There was his partner, Julian Crane, whose ambition was matched only by his greed. There was his wife's lawyer, who had recently started attending their private meetings for estate planning. And there was Amanda herself, who had quietly convinced him to sign over contingency rights just months before his disappearance. It was all coming together now, like a picture slowly emerging from fog. The thought of betrayal became his new fire. It burned away despair, replacing it with anger and focus. When storms came, he no longer prayed for calm. He welcomed them, watching the sky break open, as if daring the world to try and kill him again. One night, after a particularly violent storm, Robert found something new washed ashore, a small, waterlogged crate with foreign lettering on its side. It had likely fallen from a passing cargo ship during the chaos. He pried it open with a sharp stone and discovered inside a half-broken flashlight, a roll of wire, and a sealed can of biscuits that must have been older than his company. The biscuits were hard and tasted like sand, but he ate them slowly, savoring every bite like a luxury meal. The flashlight, miraculously, still worked. When its weak beam flickered to life, illuminating the walls of his shelter, he laughed for the first time in weeks. Light, real, artificial light, was something he had almost forgotten. He began to use it at night, tracing the patterns of the trees and rocks, imagining he was back in his office, walking through plans and blueprints. The beam cut through the dark like a knife, steady and sharp, just like his resolve. He had to live. He had to get back. Not just to survive, but to see the faces of those who had written him off, or worse, celebrated his death. 2 months into his isolation, Robert had started to accept the possibility that no rescue was coming. The world had moved on without him. He would have to make his own way off the island or die trying. He built a raft once, using bamboo and the remnants of the fuselage, tying them together with vines and wire. It looked fragile, but it was hope made tangible. The first time he tried to push it into the waves, the current tore it apart within minutes. He dragged the pieces back, rebuilt, failed again. By the 4th attempt, he realized he would never make it far enough without navigation or proper tools. He was trapped in a cage of water. He started to lose track of his own reflection. The man he saw in the fragments of metal no longer resembled the corporate titan who had once been invited to private galas and interviewed by financial networks. His hair was long and unkempt, his eyes wild. But there was something honest in that reflection, something that had been buried under years of luxury and lies. He spent his nights watching the stars, trying to chart them the way sailors once did. He didn't know what direction was east or west anymore, but it didn't matter. The stars reminded him that the world was still there, that someone, somewhere, was living the life he had lost. Maybe Amanda was sleeping in their bed right now, or sitting at the dining table with their children, wearing a mask of mourning that hid her relief. The thought cut deeper than hunger. On the 63rd day, he saw the ship. It appeared just after dawn, when the sea was calm and the mist still hung low on the horizon. At first, he thought it was another hallucination, the kind that had come to haunt him in the quieter hours. But as the light shifted, he saw the glint of metal, the white crest of its bow cutting through the water. It was real. He froze, afraid to move in case the vision disappeared. Then instinct took over. He sprinted across the sand, waving his arms, shouting until his throat burned. "Here! I'm here!" His voice broke, but he kept screaming. The ship was moving slowly, like a ghost sliding through fog. He tore through his camp, gathering dry branches, anything that would burn. His hands shook as he lit his fire, the smoke rising in thick black columns. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, faintly, he saw movement on the ship's deck. Someone had seen him. He shouted again, jumping, waving both arms wildly, tears mixing with sweat and ash. The ship turned. It was the most beautiful sight he had ever seen. The bow angling toward the island, the white spray catching sunlight like glass. When the rescue crew finally reached him, Robert fell to his knees. He tried to speak, but no words came. The men, strangers in uniforms, with calm, professional faces, lifted him gently, offering water, wrapping a blanket around his shoulders. The sound of their voices felt unreal, as if he were waking from a dream he'd been trapped in for years. On board, they told him he had been declared dead for 6 weeks. The wreckage of his plane had never been found. Search efforts had stopped long ago. His company had issued statements, and the world had moved on. His wife, they said softly, had given a moving speech about him at a memorial service in Miami. She had taken control of Miller Technologies soon after, to preserve his legacy. Robert said nothing. He sat wrapped in his blanket, staring at the horizon as the island disappeared behind him. His lips moved once, silently, forming a single word. Amanda. When he finally saw the Miami skyline again, something inside him shifted. The towers looked smaller than he remembered, almost fragile. Reporters waited at the docks, cameras flashing, voices shouting questions he didn't hear. How did you survive? What happened up there? How does it feel to be back from the dead? He ignored them all. The air smelled of salt and gasoline, but beneath it was another scent, the faint, perfumed echo of his old life, now tainted with betrayal. When the car brought him home, the gates opened automatically, as if the system itself didn't realize he was supposed to be dead. The house stood exactly as he'd left it, immaculate and silent. But as he stepped inside, he felt the weight of strangeness, the faint hum of lights, the polished marble floors, the scent of Amanda's perfume still lingering in the air. It felt like walking into a museum dedicated to someone else. He made his way to his study, where his desk stood untouched. The family portrait still hung on the wall, Amanda, smiling, Lillian and Thomas standing on either side, their faces young and bright. He reached out and touched the frame, his fingers trembling. Then, slowly, he turned toward the monitors that lined one wall, part of the house's security system, connected to hidden cameras throughout the property. He sat down, turned on the system, and began scrolling through archived footage. The dates flickered past until he reached the morning of his flight. And there it was. Amanda in the living room, standing too close to someone. A man in a suit he recognized instantly. Julian Crane, his business partner, and the only other shareholder capable of challenging his authority. They were talking quietly, their expressions grave but their body language intimate. He unmuted the audio, his heart hammering. Amanda's voice, calm and sharp as glass. It'll look like an accident. By the time they find anything, it'll be over. The board will back you. Julian's reply, almost casual. Are you sure you can handle the kids? A pause. Then Amanda's smile, the same one she used for charity galas and public appearances. Cold, controlled. I've handled worse. Robert sat there for a long time, the sound of the ocean faint through the open window, the city lights glittering beyond the glass. His hand moved to the desk drawer, where he kept the small revolver he'd bought years ago and never used. He opened it, looked at the gun, then closed it again. Killing her would be too easy. No, she would face the truth. The world that had mourned him would learn who she really was. And for the first time since the crash, Robert Miller smiled. It wasn't joy or relief. It was the cold, patient smile of a man who had been remade by the fire of betrayal and the salt of survival. A man who had nothing left to lose. Outside, The wind picked up, rattling the palm leaves against the windows, whispering through the night. The island had given him scars and silence. Now it had given him purpose. The first thing Robert felt was the weight of the blanket draped across his shoulders, heavy and warm. The smell of salt and fuel filled his nose, and for a moment he thought he was still on the island, hallucinating the figures around him. But then the sound of voices broke through the ringing in his ears. Real human voices, layered with confusion and wonder. He blinked against the harsh sunlight and saw faces. Men in uniforms, strangers speaking his language, their words tumbling out in disbelief. He had been found. The rescue ship's deck tilted gently beneath his bare feet as they guided him toward a small cabin. Every movement felt dreamlike, fragile, as if the world itself might vanish if he blinked too long. The sea stretched endlessly around them, glinting gold under the morning sun, and somewhere behind that horizon lay the island that had both broken and remade him. One of the crewmen, a broad-shouldered man with sun-creased skin, handed him a cup of water. "Drink slow," he said softly. "You've been out there a long time." Robert nodded, his throat tightening as the cool water touched his tongue. He wanted to speak, to ask how long, to know what day it was, but his voice came out cracked, his words rasping. How long?" he managed finally. The man looked at him carefully, as though trying to soften the blow. "You went missing about 2 months ago. The Coast Guard gave up after 3 weeks. You were declared dead, Mr. Miller." Robert stared at him. The words didn't sink in right away. Declared dead. It should have meant something more. Grief, disbelief, maybe gratitude. But all he felt was a slow, dull ache spreading through his chest. The world had buried him, and he hadn't even known it. When they reached the mainland the following day, the port was already crowded. News had spread faster than he thought possible. Reporters, cameras, flashing lights, they had all gathered to capture the miracle. "Billionaire found alive after plane crash." The headlines were probably already written before he even stepped off the boat. As he walked down the dock, wrapped in a clean white shirt one of the crew had lent him, microphones and flashes closed in like a swarm of insects. "How did you survive, Mr. Miller? Did you know the rescue efforts were called off? What's the first thing you want to do now that you're home?" He ignored them all. Every question was a blur, a meaningless hum against the roar of the city he had once ruled. A car waited for him at the end of the dock, a sleek black sedan with tinted windows. The driver opened the door without a word, and Robert slid inside, the leather seat cool against his skin. For the first time in months, he was clean, warm, safe, and yet he felt none of it. The city rolled past outside the window, familiar and alien all at once. Glass towers gleamed like weapons under the sun. Billboards flashed his company's logo, slogans he had written years ago. It all looked like a museum of his former life. The car turned off the main road and into the gated community where his mansion stood, immaculate as ever. As the gates opened, he felt a strange chill, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Amanda was waiting on the front steps. She looked flawless, as always, her hair perfectly styled, her white dress spotless despite the humid air. But her face, for the first time since he had known her, showed something unscripted. Shock. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. "Robert," she whispered finally, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "My God, it's really you." He didn't answer. His gaze flicked to the door behind her, where 2 uniformed officers stood awkwardly, their expressions somewhere between duty and curiosity. One of them stepped forward. "Mr. Miller, we understand this is a difficult time, but we'll need you to come by the station in the next few days. Standard procedure for missing persons recovery." "Of course," he said evenly. His voice was calm, almost detached. Amanda reached out, her hand hesitating mid-air before it touched his arm. "I thought you were gone," she said softly. "They told us. There was nothing left to find." "I'm sure they did," Robert replied, and the words slipped out colder than he intended. Her hand froze, then withdrew. Inside the house, everything was exactly as he remembered it. The polished marble floors, the scent of her perfume lingering faintly in the air, the quiet hum of the climate system. But it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a stage, frozen mid-performance, waiting for an audience that never came. "Lillian and Thomas are at school," Amanda said, her tone shifting into something carefully neutral. "I didn't want to shock them until I was sure it was really you. I'll call them home tonight." He nodded, saying nothing. She moved to pour him a drink, her movement smooth, deliberate. She handed him a glass of whiskey, the same brand he used to prefer, and smiled faintly. "You must be exhausted. Let's sit. Tell me everything." He took the glass but didn't drink. He studied her face instead, every detail of it. The slight tremor in her lip, the way her eyes flicked toward the security camera above the door for just a second, before returning to him. He had learned to watch for those small tells on the island. Survival had made him sharper. "There's not much to tell," he said quietly. "The plane went down in a storm. I survived." "That's impossible," she whispered, shaking her head. "No one could survive that crash." "But I did." The silence that followed stretched long and thin. She looked at him with something that might have been relief or might have been fear. It was hard to tell anymore. Finally, she smiled again, too quickly. "Well, that's all that matters. You're home." He wanted to laugh, but instead he set the untouched drink down on the table and said, "I'll be in my study." The room was just as he had left. It organized, expensive, immaculate. The large windows looked out toward the ocean, and for a moment he stood there, watching the waves roll in. Then he turned to his desk and the monitors that still displayed the feeds from the house's security system. He spent the next hour going through the archived footage, starting with the days before his flight. At first, everything seemed ordinary. Amanda making calls, the children playing, the housekeepers moving about their work. But then, on the morning of the crash, he found it. The video showed her in the living room, standing close to Julian Crane, his business partner, his friend. Robert watched as they spoke in low tones, Amanda's hand resting on Julian's arm in a gesture that was far too familiar. He turned up the volume. Her voice came through the speakers, sharp and precise. "Once it's done, the shares transfer automatically. The board will vote for continuity. It'll look clean." Julian's voice followed, calm, almost casual. "You're sure he won't suspect?" "He won't have time to," Amanda replied, and she smiled, a small, practiced smile that made Robert's stomach turn. He paused the video, his hands tightening into fists. Every muscle in his body trembled, but his face remained expressionless. There it was. Proof. The confirmation of everything he had suspected on that cursed island. His wife and his partner had planned it together. They had arranged his death like a business transaction. He leaned back in his chair, the glow of the monitor washing his face in cold light. The irony was almost unbearable. He had built a company on trust, on precision, on believing that logic could control chaos. And yet it had been emotion, greed, and betrayal that destroyed him. He didn't tell anyone what he had found. Not yet. When Amanda came to the door later, asking softly if he wanted dinner, he told her no, that he needed rest. She lingered in the doorway for a moment, her silhouette framed by the dim light of the hall. "You're different," she said quietly. "Colder." "I've been through hell," he answered. That night he couldn't sleep. The bed felt too soft, the sheets too clean, the silence too heavy. He sat by the window until dawn, watching the ocean. Somewhere in the distance, a cargo ship moved slowly across the horizon, its lights flickering faintly in the dark. It looked like salvation, the same way that rescue ship had looked, and yet now he understood that salvation was just another kind of illusion. When morning came, Amanda played her role perfectly. She smiled for the reporters who camped outside the gate, stood beside him during the televised interview, her hand lightly touching his shoulder. She told the story of faith and hope, of how she never stopped believing he was alive. Her voice trembled in all the right places. Viewers across the country cried and applauded the miracle of Robert Miller's return. But when the cameras turned off, her eyes hardened. "You didn't tell me you were going to talk to the press today," she said, her voice low and sharp. "I didn't think I needed permission," he replied evenly. She smiled again, a thin, controlled expression. "Of course not. I'm just saying, we should coordinate better, for the company's sake." "The company," he repeated softly, almost to himself. "Yes, of course. For the company." He spent the following days pretending. He attended board meetings, smiling at faces that looked genuinely shocked to see him alive. He watched Amanda and Julian exchange fleeting glances across the conference table. He said nothing, let them believe he was still dazed, still recovering. Meanwhile, he met privately with his attorney, quietly transferring his assets back under his control. At night, he continued to watch the footage, every clip, every timestamp. He cataloged everything, saving copies onto an encrypted drive. The evidence was clear. All he needed was patience. The storm that had nearly killed him had not been the end. It had been the beginning of something colder, more deliberate. When he looked in the mirror now, he saw not the desperate castaway who had begged the ocean for mercy, but a man reborn in silence and fury. The island had stripped him down to his essence, and that essence was unbreakable. Amanda thought she had buried him. Julian thought he had inherited his empire. But neither of them understood what kind of man the island had sent back. Robert Miller was alive, and this time, he was the storm. The days that followed his return unfolded with a quiet, deliberate pace. The world outside his mansion celebrated the miracle of Robert Miller's survival, while inside its walls, silence reigned. Each morning brought new headlines, glowing features about resilience, faith, and the human spirit. Each evening, new invitations arrived, talk shows, awards, corporate honors. But Robert accepted none of them. He stayed home, surrounded by the ghosts of his old life, pretending to recover while carefully preparing for what came next. Amanda played her role flawlessly. To the outside world, she was the devoted wife reunited with her lost husband, her beauty framed by grief and joy in equal measure. She cooked for him, brought him coffee in the mornings, smiled gently when visitors came by. But Robert could see the cracks forming beneath that perfect surface. She was nervous, not enough to betray herself outright, but enough for him to sense it in every glance, every cautious movement. She was waiting for him to slip, to reveal how much he knew. He gave her nothing. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Robert sat alone in his study, the soft glow of the monitor illuminating his face. He had spent hours combing through the last pieces of data from his company's network. During his absence, Amanda and Julian had moved quickly, too quickly. Shares had been transferred, projects reassigned, and several large accounts had been quietly redirected through offshore subsidiaries. The pattern was elegant, almost invisible, but Robert recognized the signature. He had built systems like this himself, designed to hide power behind bureaucracy. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, remembering the island, the endless wind, the hunger, the storm that had nearly ended him. Those days had burned something out of him, but they had also tempered him. He was no longer a man who reacted out of emotion. He was something colder, sharper, patient. The first person he contacted was Detective Harold Jennings, a friend from years ago, a man who had once helped with corporate security. Jennings had the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much, but he owed Robert a favor. They met in a small cafe on the edge of downtown, away from the cameras and the glass towers. "You're supposed to be resting," Jennings said, sitting down across from him. "Half the country thinks you're still in shock." Robert stirred his coffee, smiling faintly. "Let them think that. I need your help." Jennings frowned. "If this is about the crash—" "It wasn't an accident," Robert interrupted. "I have proof." He slid a small flash drive across the table. "Security footage from my house, the day I left." Jennings studied him for a long moment before picking it up. "You sure you want to open that box, Robert? Once we start down this road, there's no going back." "I've already been to hell," Robert said quietly. "I'm not afraid of the road home." Jennings nodded. "I'll have my people look at it." Quietly. For the next week, Robert waited. He spent time with his children, who still looked at him as if he were some kind of miracle. Lillian clung to him constantly, afraid he might vanish again, while Thomas followed him everywhere, full of questions about the island. Amanda, ever watchful, played the part of the doting wife, her every gesture calculated. She smiled when she had to, spoke softly, never too long. One evening, he found her in the living room, pouring wine into 2 glasses. She looked up and smiled, that same practiced smile he once thought was love. "You're quiet tonight," she said, "still getting used to being home." He took the glass but didn't drink. "Home," he repeated. "That's an interesting word. You ever think about what it means?" She tilted her head. "What are you talking about?" "Home," he said again, turning toward the window where the ocean shimmered beyond the glass. "It's supposed to be a place where you're safe, where people love you." Her smile faltered slightly, but only for a second. "You sound poetic tonight," she said lightly. "Maybe the island changed you." He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time saw her not as his wife, not even as his betrayer, but as the stranger she had become. He smiled faintly. It did. When Jennings called 3 days later, his voice was grim. "You were right," he said. "We traced financial transactions linked to your wife's attorney. Offshore accounts, shell corporations, life insurance transfers. Someone paid a private contractor 2 days before your flight. We also found communication logs between her and Crane, enough to open an investigation." Robert closed his eyes. "Do it," he said. The next morning, 2 unmarked cars pulled up to the mansion. Amanda was in the kitchen when the officers entered. For a moment, she didn't understand. When Jennings read her the charges: conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, obstruction, her face went pale. She turned toward Robert, disbelief widening her eyes. "You did this?" she whispered. "I didn't do anything," he said quietly. "You did." She lunged toward him, her mask finally cracking. "You think this makes you free? You think the company, the money, the children, they'll ever be yours again after this?" He didn't answer. The officers took her by the arms, leading her away. The last thing he heard was her voice, echoing down the hallway, half scream, half curse. "You'll never forgive yourself, Robert. Never." When the door closed behind her, the silence that followed was deeper than anything he had known. It wasn't peace exactly. More like an emptiness, the echo of something broken beyond repair. Julian Crane was arrested 2 days later. His lawyers fought, denied everything, but the evidence was too clear. His smug confidence collapsed in court when the recordings were played, the voices of him and Amanda plotting, their words cold and deliberate. The media devoured the story, turning it into spectacle. Betrayal of the billionaire. The wife who wanted everything. Robert attended every hearing, sitting in the back, expressionless. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, he felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, just a quiet exhaustion that seemed to seep into his bones. Amanda didn't look at him when the guards led her away. After the trial, he sold most of the company. The board protested, begged him to reconsider, but he was done with it all. The endless meetings, the greed, the false friendships. He kept a small share, enough to secure his children's future, and walked away. The fortune he had built no longer meant anything. He bought a house far from Miami on a quiet stretch of coastline in Northern California. It wasn't a mansion, just a simple 2-story home overlooking the sea. The ocean there was different, colder, calmer, the waves whispering instead of crashing. He moved there with Lillian and Thomas, who adjusted faster than he expected. They went to school, made friends, laughed again. In the evenings, after they had gone to bed, Robert would stand on the porch, watching the horizon. Sometimes, when the light was right, he could almost see the outline of the island in his mind, the rocks, the palms, the sound of the waves against the shore. It wasn't a place of fear anymore. It was a reminder. He had gone there, a broken man, and returned remade. The island had stripped him of everything he thought mattered: money, status, control, and left him with only himself. And that, he realized, was enough. One afternoon, Lillian came to him with a drawing she had made at school. It showed the 3 of them standing by the sea, hand in hand. Above them, she had written, "Home." He smiled, the first true smile in months, and felt something ease inside him. The world had taken everything from him once, but now he understood that survival wasn't just about living. It was about choosing what to live for. At night, he sometimes dreamed of the storm, of fire and wind and endless water. But when he woke, the sound of his children's laughter filled the house, and the memories faded like mist. He still carried scars, the ones on his skin and the ones deeper inside, but they no longer defined him. They were simply proof that he had endured. As he stood on the shore one evening, the sun sinking low behind the waves, he whispered to the wind, not as a prayer, but as a promise. Never again. The sea answered with a sigh, as if it understood. And in that moment, Robert Miller finally felt free. Enjoyed the video? Hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and check out more videos on the channel. Share this one with your friends. It really helps the channel grow.